and welcome to Wrongway's Colombia cast with me, Brendan Wrongway Corrigan. Now, there is much talk about what the post-coronavirus world will look like. Those of a more optimistic view speak of an overdue reappraisal of our values and move away from an over-the-top adoration of excessively paid celebrities and sports stars to a greater appreciation of the heretofore unsung heroes who play crucial roles in our everyday lives. Linked to this is a fairer distribution of the world's wealth. In this regard, there aren't too many countries ahead of Colombia that would, in theory at least, benefit from a reduction in crippling inequality. As I've said oft times before, Colombia has the three economic worlds in one. To delve a little more into this, we're joined by Leopoldo Fergusson, Associate Professor in the Economics Faculty at Bogotá's Los Andes University. Leopoldo, thanks for taking the time to talk to us in these strange quarantine times.
Thank you very much, Brendan, for having me. It's a pleasure.
The pleasure is all ours. Now, you've written extensively on Colombia's income inequality and provided potential solutions to closing that gap. So just to start off, to put things into context, how unequal is the country in this regard?
Well, it is very unequal, no matter how you look at it. To put it in just one sentence, it is basically one of the most unequal countries in the most unequal region in the world. And if you want to look at some numbers, you can look at different dimensions. So, for instance, if you look at inequality in land tenure and in land ownership, economists, we use a common coefficient of inequality, which is the Gini coefficient, which goes from 0 when basically everyone has the same share of income or wealth or whatever it is that we're measuring, to 1 when it is fully concentrated in just one person. So if you look at that coefficient for Latin America, it's 0.79. So it's very unequal. If you compare to Europe, it's 0.57. Africa is close to that, and Asia is close to that, like closer to 0.5, whereas Latin America is closer like to 0.8. And within Latin America, South America is more unequal than Central America. South America has a Gini coefficient of 0.85. And within South America, Colombia is among the most unequal countries. It has a Gini coefficient of 0.88 in land ownership. These numbers that I'm giving you are from an Oxfam report, and of course, comparing different countries and their data sources is an issue. But trying to get as comparable data as possible, we get this picture in which, within one of the most unequal or the most unequal sub-region in the world, Colombia is among the most unequal countries. And this is true not only of land, as I just noted with these numbers, but it's also if you look at income, whatever people earn in a given year. And in that case, one thing that is kind of disheartening is that if you look at World Bank data, for example, reporting the Gini coefficient for a bunch of Latin American countries, it's not only that Colombia is also up there among the most unequal, but it's also that it has been persistently unequal. There are some countries that have been able to reduce inequality significantly, like Chile and Bolivia. Colombia, together with Brazil, has had among the highest and more persistent levels of income inequality. The Gini coefficient is hard to read, but if you want another comparison, in Colombia, these estimates of how much of the wealth and of the income is held by the top X% of the population is kind of another telling figure. And say Colombia has the top 1% of the top richest 1% of the population has 20% of the income in Colombia. If you compare that to, say, the Netherlands, in the Netherlands, that percentage is just 6.3%. And if you compare it to other countries, even in the region, like in Argentina, it's 16%. It's still 4 percentage points lower than in Colombia. So, also on income, huge inequality. Another dimension is, the extent to which generations can move up and down the social ladder. And like a relatively recent exercise by Angulo, Gaviria, Páez, and Acevedo shows that not only inequality is very, very correlated to intergenerational lack of mobility, which means that, my fortune is very much dictated by the fortune of my parents. But also Colombia, when you compare it to other countries in the region like Chile or Mexico, is especially not mobile. It's especially the case that people's incomes depend a lot on what their parents' income or parents' education was. And finally, the last dimension of inequality, just to end with that, is that, it's not only inequality between different social classes and levels of income. It's also inequality between regions. I have a paper in which we look at the data on regional inequality in Colombia. This is work with Carlos Molina, James Robinson, and Juan Vargas. And we show that there have been huge disparities between different regions in the country and that they have been extremely persistent. And that even more starking than, say, the gap that there is in income between the US and Colombia is the gap in income between some regions in Colombia and other regions in Colombia. So just to give you one number, if you look at a measure of poverty, which is called a multidimensional poverty, an effort to measure poverty in the population, in places like Envigado or Chía, suburbs of the main cities in Colombia, only about 5% of the population are poor with that measure. But in places like Uribia in Guajira or Cumaribo in Vichada or the Alto Baudó in Chocó, it's over 90% of the people who have poverty. So, the inequalities within the country are enormous. So this just, I guess, gives you a flavor of how unequal this country is.
And the challenge it is to try and reduce that. I mean, I always think that Bogotá itself is almost a microcosm of the country in a whole, because you talked about the different regions and the inequality between the regions as well. But even, I'm guessing here in Bogotá, you have the three worlds in one. You can go to Ciudad Bolívar, and I'm guessing that figure that you mentioned there will be pretty high. And then in the leafier suburbs in the north of the city, you'd have wealthier people than would exist in Europe. I guess that's fairly true to say, yeah?
Completely, yeah. I think you can think of this as Jim Robinson, which is like I mentioned before we started the conversation. One important mentor of mine and a co-author, and we now work together in many of these issues. We like to think about this like a fractal. It's like there is inequality, and then you zoom in into different geographic areas, and there is inequality within that area, and then you zoom in more, and there is still inequality, and so forth. So you are totally right that there is a huge inequality between Chocó and Cundinamarca, two states, departamentos in Colombia, but there is also huge inequality within Bogotá. So yeah, that's completely right.
Yeah, so, okay, you've set down how bad it is, and it seems like almost an impossible challenge to correct that. But you have put forward different ideas that we can reduce this inequality. And I know now we're talking in a time of the coronavirus crisis, so everything seems to be put on hold in a sense. But you also said in a recent article in La Repubblica newspaper that actually the coronavirus is just bringing to light and putting it more in the picture of all these problems. So how exactly do we go about this from your economics perspective that we can reduce this inequality?
Well, that's a great and much harder question. So, to try to get at what can we do about it, let me just say a couple of things of what I think are the root reasons behind it, so that I can build into explaining what the kind of solutions could be. So the first thing that I would say is that this economic inequality that we already referred to, one important thing is that it is not that Colombia is very unequal. It's also that our policies do very little to reduce this concentration. So, market economies in many different countries create economic concentration. But many market economies that create economic concentration then have the government stepping in and creating redistributive taxation and government expenditure that reduces the extent of income inequality. That doesn't happen in Colombia. So if you see, for instance, the average of the OECD, and you measure the Gini coefficient before taxes and after taxes, the Gini coefficient is reduced about a third on average in these countries. And even in America, in Latin America, that reduction is close to 7%. In Colombia, it's basically negligible. Basically, you have that the extent to which tax policies are able to reduce economic inequality is basically 1%. It's really, really not significant what we're doing. So that's one important thing to bear in mind when we think about possible solutions. And the second thing that I would say before I talk about solutions, so that we can, suggest what the root problems are, is that I think that the underlying problem is that there is not only economic inequality, but political inequality that essentially, helps explain both the existence and the persistence of an economic inequality. We have done tremendous strides, I guess, especially since the 1991 Constitution, to empower otherwise disenfranchised groups, ethnic groups, income groups, regions, but it's still insufficient. And there are many ways in which you can observe that Colombia is still a politically unequal country. And so
Oh,
let me, I could just explain what I mean by politically unequal and give you a couple of examples. So what I mean is basically that not all voices are heard by the political system with the same strength. Some people, democracy listens to some people in Colombia more than other people. The example that I love to give about this, which is a very sad example, is the story of the false positives in Colombia. So you've probably heard about the false positives. Is this phenomena during the fight against the FARC in which the army essentially killed civilians and presented them as if they were guerrilla fighters to sort of show that they were fighting hard against the guerrilla. But these were civilians who were not involved in the guerrilla. Now, how many people died in this way? We don't really know, but it's probably in the order of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. You hear numbers like that around. Okay. Now, to get a sense of how many people that is, I always suggest that we could do this thought experiment in which we assume that rather than killing, humble campesinos and relatively poorer segments of the population through this practice, actually a whole generation of students from the fancy schools in Bogotá who graduate each year, the international schools who graduate each year, were killed in this way in Colombia. And that's essentially the order of magnitude of this tragedy that occurred in Colombia. And you can really not imagine that something like that could have happened in Colombia. But it did. It happened. It's only that it didn't happen to these relatively well-off Colombian students. So I think that the reason why this is interesting is because it shows that some lives of some people in Colombia are worth much more than other lives.
Apologies there, Leopoldo, but I actually lost you for a little bit here at this end. But I think the program I'm using will have recorded what you said. So if you just want to summarize, and we'll take you up on your next point.
Yes, of course, I can pick up. So I just gave you one example of why that shows very starkly that Colombia is a politically unequal country in which some lives of some people actually are worth more than the lives of others. Another kind of illustration of that comes from the tax regime. For instance, in corporate taxes, there's work by Garay and Espitia, there's work by Moreno and Carranza, there's work by many economists showing that different firms in Colombia end up paying very different tax rates. And it's very hard to find an economic rationale for why they are doing it. It's really because they can use a very complex tax code that we have that is full of exemptions and differential treatments for different types of firms and so on, that allows different firms that maybe have the resources to use a very smart tax lawyer that will help them reduce their tax burden, that they end up paying much more taxes than others. And that's horrible for productivity because it means that it's not that the more talented entrepreneurs are able to necessarily do better. It's probably the ones that have the resources to take better advantage of these differences, or actually the ones who can create these differences. And there is work by Eslava and Melendez, two economists also, that shows that the kind of treatments that some sectors in the economy get do have to do a lot with the political influence that they have. So again, political inequality is breeding differences in the economic structure that actually make us believe that the political imperfections in the system are what are leading to all these problems. And finally, another dimension of inequality is regional representation. There's work by Adolfo Meisel, which we have updated with my colleagues in this paper that I already mentioned on regional inequality, in which we can show how the government cabinet is really, really lopsided in terms of which regions get more representation than others. So, this is a long detour to say, we can speculate in a minute about possible solutions, but the roots are much deeper than just economic inequality.
Okay. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned tax loopholes or whatever, and companies maybe not paying their fair share, because obviously I'm an Irishman, and that's been a big debate about Apple and other big multinationals in Ireland. But I think it was another Ferguson, Neil Ferguson, giving a speech on wealth distribution and income redistribution, that Ireland is actually one of the most unequal until the tax system kicks in and then redistributes that income. So even if Apple don't pay their fair share of taxes, at least whatever they do pay goes maybe to where it's needed most in theory anyway. So I'm guessing, is this where Colombia needs to do better in terms of the redistribution of whatever taxes they collect? And of course they need to collect a lot more, I'm guessing.
Yes, I think that so there are two things that one can work on. On the one hand, you can create a fairer kind of playing ground so that the market itself does not distribute wealth so unequally. So that, like I was saying before, entrepreneurs who are talented are able to do a good firm and are able to do well, and they face more or less the same rules than others. That's kind of a recipe for a more equal distribution of resources and a better taking advantage of the talents that a country has, than one where how well you do actually depends on how much you can take advantage of some loopholes that were created possibly with political influence and not out of any economic rationale. So that's one thing that you can work on at the level of the firms. At the level of the individuals, you have to create the opportunities so that individuals are able to exploit their talents. So that means good education and high quality education for a lot of people, good provision of public goods no matter where you are, and that these differences that we were talking before, those differences in poverty that we were mentioning between Chia and El Alto Audó, of course, imply that someone who's born in El Alto Audó is much less likely to be successful than someone that is born in Chia. So that's one set of things that you can do. But as you were saying, the other set of things that you can do is that once the market has assigned the distribution of income and wealth, well, that if that's too unequal, and it is in the Colombian case, then the tax code needs to do something about it, and we do nothing about it with our tax code, essentially. So the answer is yes. You have to, I think, work on both ends. The first one takes much more time, so the second one is urgent, and we need a more intense and more progressive taxation.
But do you think that might be sped up now, the implementation of that with this coronavirus crisis? Because one of the measures that I heard, at least for public employees who are earning more than 10 million, that their incomes are going to be taxed more. I know that's at the individual level, but there might be measures in the coronavirus crisis going forward that might actually become permanent. History has taught us many lessons that emergency measures that are brought in wars or whatever, we saw it in Europe during World War I and World War II, then they become permanent. So do you see maybe a chink of light in that perhaps people will start looking at that? Because obviously the measures, as most people would agree, are affecting the poorer here much more so than we'll say the comfortable classes who can work from home, whereas many in the poorer barriers can't in the poorer barrios. So is there an opportunity in this crisis now to lay down markers for a better redistribution?
Yeah, I think that definitely is an opportunity. Now, could we be optimistic that this opportunity is something that Colombia is going to take advantage of or not? That I'm not sure. I think the opportunity is there, and we could take either a positive path or a negative path. We could go for the better or for the worse. I mean, for the worse, one thing is that, as you said, this is hitting the more vulnerable population more. So the direct effect of the crisis and the virus is to increase inequality. Another reason to be a bit worried is that the solutions to this depend a lot on trust towards each other, that we are taking care of each other, and on trust towards the decisions that the governments do. And Latin America and Colombia in particular have very little trust in their institutions and actually low levels of intergenerational trust. So, if things turn badly, maybe this lack of trust can get even worse. And you see some worrying signs of division and polarization and finger pointing and, xenophobia and even medical doctor phobia, where people are saying, I don't want to be close to a medical doctor because they may be contaminated. So, there are some reasons to worry. But as you said, there are also some reasons to have hope. This crisis is making these gaps in the society much more visible. I believe, and as you already mentioned, I wrote recently for La Repubblica saying that the COVID crisis is just making more visible. It's like a lens that is magnifying the kind of disparities that society has to go through silently in Colombia every day. So people who are informal or who are very poor, all the time, even when the crisis is not hitting, they may get sick and then have their whole kind of livelihood in peril. And that's exactly what's happening now. It's only that it's happening at a scale that is much faster or much bigger than what it usually happens in everyday life. So by making those vulnerabilities visible, governments, including the Colombian government, have had to step up and support the vulnerable population. There are some signs that this lack of trust that we had at the baseline is perhaps not so much of a problem in this crisis, and actually that people may start thinking, okay, this is an opportunity to come together. We have to trust each other. We have to trust the government. The government is doing its job. So it could be an opportunity. And as you said, when it comes to inequality, I guess perhaps the recent better known work on this is the work by Walter Scheidel he has a book called The Great Leveler, which exactly says that huge efforts and huge impacts on reduction in inequality only come after periods of violence or catastrophes. So it could be that if we adopt aggressive redistribution to go through this crisis, some of that redistribution actually persists after the crisis, and that would be, I think, would be a positive thing, because if governments see that not only we need to protect the vulnerable population in this crisis, but that this vulnerable population goes through similar issues even in normal times, and therefore they need support, and we need more progressive taxation, and we need to have tax policies and government policies in general fixing the extreme inequalities that the market sometimes delivers, then maybe this is going to be a good opportunity. But we cannot take it for granted.
Yeah, of course. Now, you said as well in a previous article that if the better off taxpayers, they pay a little bit more, that they'll want to see their money then being properly spent, not being obviously wasted in corruption or whatever, embezzlement. But my experience here in some regards has been it's quite an individualistic society at times, so that it lacks sometimes a community spirit. Is that an issue that you think might exist here, that people who do have more don't really care as long as they can send their Juan or Juanita off to the top universities, and they don't really care about the rest?
Yes, I think that's a real problem. So it connects back to what we were saying about trust. People do not trust each other too much in Latin America, and in Colombia in particular. There is this individualistic kind of culture in which you mind your own business. I don't know if your immersion in Colombia has been sufficiently long that you are familiar with the expression "no sea sapo,"
Yeah.
which is basically, mind your own business. And actually, with a colleague of mine, Jose Guerra, and with Jim Robinson, who we talked about already, we have a research project to try to understand the origins and the implications of this norm, in which you essentially tell someone who is asking you to behave prosocially, you tell that person, hey, mind your own business. It's none of your business. So basically, you stop in a stoplight and you decide to pass through the stoplight and not allow the pedestrians to go in. And a third person tells this driver, hey, you should stop in the stoplight. So a typical Colombian driver will turn around and will say, no sea sapo, so meaning mind your own business. And this is very strange for people in other cultures, because what do you mean mind your own business? Of course, it is my business that you behave socially as we all are supposed to behave. But in Colombia, there is this very individualistic culture that reinforces this idea that everyone should fend for themselves, and makes this kind of redistributive taxation, working for others, and so on, complicated. Now, sometimes the crisis brings the better out of people, and we saw recently how in the effort that Bogotá put together and Medellin put together to collect money to support the more vulnerable population during the crisis, many people were willing to give money, so they were not just saying mind your own business.
Yeah.
But this is still something that is there in Colombian society. So yeah, I think that is a hurdle that might stand in the way of looking for more permanent solutions to some of the problems of Colombian society.
Because I mean, that's really at the root of this, in a sense, and reading all the articles that you've published on this, that it needs the richer people, those who can pay, to pay a little bit more, that it brings up the level of the poorer people here and the most vulnerable, and that it levels the playing field a little bit more. But those in the more comfortable classes seem happy enough with what they have. Now, I guess, again, we talked about the post-crisis, that maybe there will be a change and we need a crisis to implement that change. And also we saw just before Christmas the protests, and maybe that's a sign of a rising working class moving on to middle class, who didn't come from wealth but see the failings of the state. So an optimist, and I like to think I'm an optimist, might say that there are the chinks of light there, that we will see the change.
Yeah, I was optimistic also when I saw the protests. I think that speaks of people mobilizing to look for goals that are legitimate. You can argue about the how, what's the best way to attain some of the goals that they were looking for. But I think it's very hard to argue against the kind of indications that they were demanding, and the fact that they were getting together to demand them collectively is a sign of hope. It's a sign that perhaps we can break a number of vicious cycles that make these features of the Colombian society very permanent. So, as you were speaking about, the relatively better off not caring too much, I think that relates a lot to something that I've discussed in a few of my writings, which I call the public goods trap, which is basically a vicious cycle, which is present in very unequal societies like Colombia, and that is hard to break because it reinforces itself. So let me explain this trap to you with a very simple example. It's basically a cycle in which a low supply of public goods by the state creates the seeds to reinforce itself, and you never break out from this equilibrium. So think of public education in Colombia. There is good coverage, but high quality education is really in short public supply. If you want high quality education, there are a handful, or not a handful, but few public institutions that really provide super high quality education, especially when you talk about, primary school and high school and so on. The universities that are high quality, they are typically good, but maybe that comes too late and you need actually earlier public intervention. So what happens when public schools are not sufficiently high quality, that low supply of high quality education? Well, the people who are wealthy enough choose to exit the system and just, pay for a private high quality education. But if these wealthy people exit the system, then they don't have stakes anymore to demand a high quality public education. So now we all of a sudden went from a low supply of high quality public education to a low demand of high quality public education, because precisely the people who are wealthier, who have more influence, who have more resources, are not really demanding high quality public education because they already solved their solution by their own. They minded their own business. And so you have a low demand, and if there's low demand, of course there's going to be low supply of high quality education. Now, in this process, in this loop, the poorer people get left out and do not have access to this high quality private education that imply paying high fees. So this is really rooted in economic inequality, and this is rooted in political inequality as well, because if this was a sufficiently politically representative country, then these people who are left out could demand high quality public education and get it. So we have that problem, and I think that's this basically is a loop that reinforces itself. It's hard to fight against it. But when you see phenomena like, the protest and collective mobilization, you can get some hope that people who are not being heard enough are trying to make their voices heard, and perhaps the government is going to step by step work into improving this kind of gaps that we still have in many dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mention education, because a number of friends of mine who have children, and some of them children now adolescents, they're debating not sending their children to third level education now, because it's just ridiculously expensive, the top universities here. So that kind of a change, if these are, well, they're meant to be middle-class people, I guess that's what they'd be classified as, and they're thinking now not sending their children to third-level education. I guess if it gets to that level, then the government would have to do something to change it.
Yes, and I think, when we are discussing the third-level education, when we're discussing the possibility of some problems at that level, it's probably already too late. There's work by my colleague Raquel Bernal and others who show that the gap starts to open as early as when kids are 2 years old, between the rich and the poor. And so even when you are in a position to decide whether or not to go to a university and you graduated from secondary school, you are already within a privileged few. So I think these gaps start early and start to widen, and the government indeed needs to do something to provide good opportunities for all, and we are not doing enough of that. Of course, I don't want to sound completely pessimistic and say that Colombia has not done anything. We have a lot of progress to show in a number of dimensions. But we cannot just, give ourselves pats in the back and say that things are going fine. There are still a lot of things that we have to work hard on, and these kinds of problems is certainly one of them.
Yeah. Now, I remember reading a statistic, you might be able to tell me if it was right or wrong, but that only about 3 million of the almost 50 million population here, of course, out of the working population, I guess that's probably about a third of that or whatever, 20 million, but only 3 million actually pay income tax. So the pool is small enough in that regard, because you have so many informal workers as well, and maybe some of those informal workers who would benefit from a better redistribution, but they're happier in their informal work. There's that other anomaly in Colombia as well at play.
Yeah, completely. So if we talk about opportunities that this crisis may bring, and one of the huge problems that we have in Colombia with the way the state works is the weakness of not only how progressive taxation is, but how prevalent it is. And you are completely right. I don't have the numbers on the top of my mind, but very few people are actually paying any income taxes. So one important thing that we could take advantage of, unfortunately, the president said no already. He said this is no time for a tax reform, but I do think this would be an ideal time for a tax reform. Both economic theory and evidence suggests that crises are good moments to push for tax reforms. There is, this famous work by Alberto Alesina and Alan Drayson, two economists who developed a theory in which they say, doing tax reforms is really hard because everyone may agree that we need to raise more taxes, but no one wants to be the one who's paying for a higher share. So we don't agree on that, but when there's a crisis and we are really having a hard time, someone is going to give up and the political consolation is going to come up and we're going to agree on some kind of distribution of the burden. So that's a theory. But actually in Colombia, that theory has a lot of empirical evidence in favor of it. There's this very nice overview of tax history in Colombia by Roberto Junguito and Hernán Rincón. And they show that in Colombia, many of the most important tax measures have been taken in times of crisis. So this crisis would be an ideal period in which we could do a number of things with our tax system that will make this society much better. So the first one is related to what you said, which is basically strengthening personal income taxation, so that it's no longer true that after-tax distribution is exactly the same as before-tax distribution. And that implies real progressive taxation, that implies putting higher taxes on the relatively wealthier people, both on their income and possibly also on their wealth. But it also implies having more people in Colombia simply report their taxes and their income, sorry, even if they in the end do not have to pay. Like now, imagine, for instance, if we had right now in Colombia universal tax reporting, so that even people who have low incomes, they don't have to pay taxes, but they tell the tax authorities how much money they made. And in fact, in some cases, what they will get is actually some tax credit, some negative income tax. They will get some support. And we now know how important that is. If we could have like a better count of who is poor in Colombia now, who is vulnerable in Colombia now, which we don't because so many people are informal, we could be helping people much better. So that's one dimension in which we should definitely work on.
I was going to say that there's.
Go ahead.
But I was going to say there's a lot of dark forces, I guess, behind that as well, because obviously we need to talk about the illegalities that exist in this country, and that obviously brings in the drug trade with it as well. So there'll be a lot of people who wouldn't want to be letting the state know where their money comes from too, so they can happily hide behind informality, I guess.
Yeah, so that's a problem. I mean, why is it that we have not developed a sufficiently strong system of, tracking people and knowing what they're doing and fixing, informality? So one thing has to do with the illegal economy, and that's probably an important share. But it's also important to understand that much of it is not illegal economy. It's, it's not illegal in the sense of, drugs or smuggling or things like that. That's huge, and that's a huge problem to solve. But it's also informal just in the sense that, we are not going to abide by regulation. I'm not going to pay your Social Security. But otherwise, you are just doing a legitimate business. You are, you are working as a contractor for some otherwise legal activity. Now, why don't we create sufficiently formal jobs? Jobs that are reporting to the tax authorities, that are creating, their contributions to the Social Security and so forth. So I think it has to do with what I was mentioning earlier in our talk, which has to do with firms having each of them like their own tax regime, because they can use so many loopholes that they can have some of them really, really low tax rates, and some of them have such tax rates that they are not profitable on otherwise perfectly good ideas and perfectly reasonable investments. So if we could eliminate these distortions, and we could eliminate these very different tax rates that firms have, that are determined possibly by political influence or access to resources to use the best loopholes in the tax code and so forth, then we could promote much higher productivity, because people with a good idea could just basically work and put that idea into business and make it a reality. And we cannot do that sufficiently in Colombia, and therefore we have low productivity, and therefore we have low job creation of good quality jobs with Social Security and so on. And the other is, direct costs of job creation when there are very high, taxes on labor, which is probably still the case in Colombia. So I do think that there are dark forces that will make any of these efforts hard. But it's not that all of them are linked to, illegal economies that are going to try to stay in the underground no matter what. Some of them are actually a symptom of the problems that we were talking about earlier, and that we could tackle by simplifying the tax code. Now, Unfortunately, the current government is not very much aligned with that. In fact, they not only said that this is not time for a tax reform, but in fact, before the crisis, they pushed for a tax reform that actually created more of these loopholes and more of these gifts and more of these special treatments for some sectors of the economy against others. So that's actually a pity, and that makes me less optimistic that we're going to take good advantage of this opportunity to do these kind of changes, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, Leopoldo, I'm not sure of your political creed, but it almost sounds like you're saying that Colombia could do with something that's a little bit more social democratic. People might have said Juan Manuel Santos was, but I'm not 100% sure of that. So do you think that the current administration is a little bit too cozy with big business, and we're unlikely to see any changes with them?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not too optimistic with the current administration because the kind of program that they were putting forward before the crisis, let's see how it changes after, was very much in line with the idea that by creating some benefits to some sectors of the economy and so on, you could grow, and you could grow so much that actually the benefit that you gave would pay for itself, because you would create so much growth that you would get extra revenues, and that would pay for itself, which is, delusional. I don't think there's any good evidence that that has happened at all, and especially when the benefits are actually targeted at different sectors, when we know actually that we can create some sound industrial policies in which we, as governments, play an active role in incentivizing some activities and, which are crucial and so on. But the way to get it is not with improvised benefits to some sectors of the economy that are probably going to be politically captured and are going to just make the whole problem that we are discussing much worse. Now, on my political views, do they align with Santos or not? That's a really tricky question because on the one hand, I really disagree with many of the things that the Santos administration, like many others in Colombia, did to handle politics, which is a very clientelistic kind of pattern of political exchanges, and we can delve into that a bit. On the other hand, he did push for some set of reforms that are in the direction of solving some of these underlying problems that we were mentioning. Like, I think that there are several elements in the peace process, for instance, that go in line with trying to give voice to sectors and regions in the population in a way that maybe they could help reduce some sort of political inequalities that could solve some of the problems that we were talking about earlier.
Hmm.
Um, but on the other hand, like I said, I'm not completely happy with, for instance, his tax policies. They weren't maybe as bad as Duque's, but they were not ideal either. And he, like every other Colombian president I think we have had to date, basically managed politics through a very clientelistic pattern of political exchanges. And I think that's a big problem because I think that clientelism basically breeds stake weakness, and stake weakness creates clientelism, and that's a very complicated vicious cycle that it's really hard to get out of. So we could talk a bit more about that if you're interested, but I think that's a main thing, a main problem that Colombia has.
We'll probably go on for another episode as well, Leo, although we could probably talk for another hour about that in many ways. But I mean, just briefly, in a sense, my experience with some of the working class people here who go out and vote, you would think that they might vote for presidents that might be slightly more social democratic in their thinking and in their policies, but they tend to go for more conservative forces that in the midterm would work against them. I find that quite strange here from the outside looking in, that those working classes to poorer classes tend to vote very conservatively.
Yeah, well, I guess first of all, not many Colombians vote.
Yeah.
If you look at turnout, it's unfortunately very, very low, and that really has to do a lot with the lack of trust in institutions and the feeling that actually your vote won't make such a difference. And it also makes clientelism, which I was referring to, much easier because you only need, a lower share of votes, a lower amount of votes to be able to get into office. So let me just mention a bit what I wanted to say about clientelism because I think it connects a lot to what you are saying
Hmm.
because it helps explain much of the political outcomes that we observe in Colombia and why some politicians thrive and not others. So, clientelism is typically defined as, the exchange of political support for some type of, targeted particularistic gift that you get. So, at the level of an election, it basically means giving your vote for a politician because that politician is either paying for you, is basically vote buying, is giving you some cash for that vote, or he's promising some kind of favor that he's going to give you or your family, like he's going to help you get a position for your kid in a public school or something like that. So that kind of exchange happens in Colombia all the time, and it happens at the level of the voter. It happens at much higher levels as well. It happens in the relationship between the president and the Congress. So, the president wants to pass a law, and in exchange for political support to pass that law, the congressman says, I'll help you, but how about you help me with these funds that I need for this entity? And it turns out that this entity, this public entity that he wants money for, is actually one where he controls jobs, so he can get a lot out of that. Okay, so this happens in Colombia all the time. And clientelistic systems have many problems. Of course, there are different degrees of this in every society, but when it's too much like this, it fragments society. It creates, every person is basically looking for its little favor, and therefore collective action is eroded, and you don't act together for common goods. You basically go get whatever favor you were needing, and that's the end of the deal. So perhaps when people go to vote in Colombia, they are not thinking of their broader benefit, but a bunch of them at least, I'm not saying that everyone votes like this, but a significant share of people vote thinking of the immediate benefit that the political leader, or the broker, as they call it commonly, the broker of the politician, offered him. So therefore they end up voting for that. They vote, they get their benefit, elections are gone, and then you forget about it, right? So you don't care too much what the ideology is because you are basically getting just this little favor. And so that's one problem of clientelism. And by eroding collective action, you are basically eroding also the institutional channels to have access to the state and to say, look, state, this is my right. I want good, high quality public education, to go back to our example, and this is my right and I'm demanding it. No, you don't do that. You go to a local broker and say, look, how can you help me getting into this school? And maybe you're lucky and you can find that. So when this happens, you get not great political outcomes, and you get a state that is not very strong, because instead of providing public goods to the majority of the population, it's basically captured by these politicians who are giving gifts here and there in order to get some political support. So that's why I was saying that, clientelism breeds a weak state, and the weak state, of course, when you are not providing good public goods, people are more vulnerable and they are more likely to just fall and vote for this little favor that they're getting. So the weak state is also promoting the excessively clientelistic pattern of political exchange.
Do you think the political terms, or for the presidential term at least anyway, that the reduction of that, and I know obviously a lot of the time the president in many ways is just a figurehead, there are many other actors at play, but Duque, for example, he's in for 4 years. He's only got 4 years. He can't be re-elected. That might bring him to implement policies that he knows aren't popular, but he believes, he has the conviction that might work. So that if you get a president who has good ideas, that they can bring them in, not worrying about re-election. Do you think that's a good call then, to have the presidential term just to one?
Yeah, I think one term or two terms is not the fundamental question in the end, but it could be a good or bad idea depending on the context. So what we found in a place like Colombia is that 2 terms, where the general institutions are not necessarily so strong, can be problematic, because you may be thinking too much on your second term, and of thinking who are the important political brokers to get you to their second term to make decisions, rather than thinking about the benefit of the broader public. Now, that might sound a bit paradoxical, because you could say, well, if there's a re-election, then actually if I can go to a second term, I have every incentive to do very well so that people vote for me. So, why is that not the case in a place like Colombia? Well, perhaps because of these political incentives that we were talking about earlier, that it's not necessarily that the elections are working as well as we would like them to work every time in Colombia, and elections are really more clientelistic than actually reflecting the needs and wants of the population. So, the fundamental problem is making a political system such that people are able to voice their concerns, think about the longer run, do not exchange their vote just for a little favor, and politicians want to have those incentives into account to decide their policies. That's the fundamental decision and the fundamental problem. Now, having those imperfections in place probably implies that 2 terms is problematic, and 1 term might lead to better outcomes in the sense that you won't use your power to distort policies and to try to stay in power by, being nice to whoever is politically powerful, but not necessarily that will actually coincide with what is best for the country. So, to put it in, economists' terms, the general equilibrium solution is not changing 1 term to 2 terms, but in partial equilibrium, given the situation that we're in, it's probably better to have just 1 term than risking having 2 terms and a very strong president basically choosing to manipulate the political system to his advantage in ways that damage the society.
Well, just finishing this up then, as a Colombian born and bred and studying this obviously very closely, do you think Colombia in a generation or 2 can be closer to, we'll say, a Nordic model of a country like Sweden or something like that, with a fair distribution? Now, of course, some people wouldn't like that. They'd like to see Colombia closer to something like the United States, but I'm thinking with a Northern European head on me at this moment in time, especially in terms of reducing inequality. Do you think that can happen in a generation, or is it just something that's going to drag on?
It's hard to make these kind of forecasts. Nobody knows, and the general advice when you get these questions, it's silly to answer them because it's very likely that you're going to be wrong.
Yeah, of course.
But I would say that these kind of changes that we are talking about, like society deciding to have decisively more progressive tax code, for instance, or strengthening the state in ways that people do not become so dependent on a favor from a politician and actually can rely on some goods as rights that they are entitled to and that they can collectively claim for, and so on, are changes that sometimes take generations and generations to occur, but sometimes they happen relatively quickly in critical junctures, in moments in which societies are put in a very extreme situation, and then out of that comes big changes. And sometimes there's something in between. In the case of Colombia, we have been basically most of the time somewhere in between. We haven't been adopting huge swings of policies when a crisis comes, but we have not been completely stagnant. That's, again, to come with another Colombian expression that you probably heard already, is this having a pace of nadadito de perro, swimming like a dog.
Yeah.
Step by step, swimming like a dog, you do little changes. And so when I think of that perspective, I think that Colombia has done that for a number of years. I have been saying all of the problems that we have had in this talk, but I can also signal a number of progress, a number of signs of progress that we have had in Colombia. So, for instance, if you look at health policy in Colombia, before 1991, if you were poor, what kind of health services could you access? Probably not very much. Since 1991, because we wrote that in the Constitution, poor people started demanding, access to some health services and some basic health insurance. And of course, there are still great barriers to access diversity and the quality along income and regional lines. But that is already something that is a right in the Constitution, and that through actions, legal actions like the tutela that you are familiar with, in which Colombians can demand the government to actually give them a fundamental right that they have. We now have a system in which you cannot differentiate the benefits of that system for the poor or the rich, and you have most of the people covered by the system. Bunch of things to improve. I'm not saying that this is the perfect example of a capable state in the making, I could also give you a number of examples in which in the health system there's a lot of clientelism, and it's not just a capable, strong state giving public goods to everyone. But I can give you these signs of optimism as well.
Yeah.
Those have happened in the past 20 years or so. And now I can only hope that Colombians choose well, because I do think that we have examples in which when you choose good leaders, they can make a difference. I always think of this anecdote in which Samuel Moreno, former mayor of Bogotá, was debating with Antanas Mockus, another mayor of Bogotá.
Uh-huh.
And Samuel Moreno gets asked by Mockus the following question. He asks, look, Samuel, so if you were in this contest for the becoming the mayor of Bogotá, and you figured out that you could buy 5,000 votes in order to defeat an opponent that is buying 50,000 votes, would you buy those votes? And Samuel Moreno almost instinctively answered right away, oh yes, I would. Because he thought, well, it's buying 5,000 votes. It's not so bad as buying 50,000. What happened after that election? That Samuel Moreno was elected, and he was the king of clientelism. He basically gave contracts to people who had given him political support to build roads in Bogotá that were not built because, of course, these people were all corrupt. So that's an example of, a clientelistic candidate getting to the power and then misusing public funds. And he was against Mockus, which is the other positive example of a leader who came to power with ideas, was elected by Bogotanos, and everyone agrees was a fantastic mayor. So, I think both characters exist in Colombia. We just need to choose more often for the Mockuses and less for the Morenos.
That's the challenge.
Yeah.
Go on,
we need
sorry.
to do these tax reforms and all these things that, let's see if Colombians choose to do that, and we, in a generation, can be a bit closer to a more just society or not.
Well, yeah, that is the hope. I was just going to add, because I read an article just the other day talking about the Casas de Justicia, the justice houses in a sense. Apparently the participation in those, again, amongst vulnerable members of the community, rather than going to a big narco king or a guy in the community who has a couple of guns to sort out justice for them, that they are now trusting in the state. So that's another positive example, at least, that people are turning to the state for solutions to justice, and not an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Yes, I think that's another good example of an area where we see the Colombian state moving. At the same time that I'm critical, and I mentioned many reasons why I worry about the way politics works in Colombia and the way the state works in Colombia, I am also critical of the people who are just simply completely pessimistic and say, I shouldn't pay taxes because everything gets stolen. Mm-hmm. Well, that's simply not true. Most of the taxes in Colombia actually get invested, and we should pay taxes instead of saying, I won't pay taxes because everything was going to get stolen. Actually, most of what I pay is used for public good in Colombia. And the minute I decide to not pay taxes because I think everything is stolen, I am a thief myself. So I'm no better than the person who is stealing public funds, and I have no right to then demand this money to be used properly. And you can think of a number of examples. So I think that some dimensions of the justice system working is a good example. And I think this Casas de Justicia is a good example. All these efforts of bringing the state closer to the people so that people can claim institutionally for their rights are good efforts. And I think there are signs that Colombia is doing that. Unfortunately, there are signs that go in the opposite direction, but we just have to cheer and support and work for the ones that are positive.
Yeah, well, I guess no country is a paradise in that regard, but hopefully, as you said, that Colombia can choose more of the better paths rather than the wrong paths in this regard. Just a quick one, Leopoldo, to wrap this up, because some of our international listeners might be interested in Fergusson. It's a very Scottish-sounding surname, so I take it there's a bit of British background in you.
There is. It's been many generations since we have been in Colombia, so I'm really a Rolo.
Yeah.
But we know the story of the family because my father actually likes looking into this and digging into the history. So we go back to a guy named Peter Fergusson, who arrived in Ciénaga which is a town near Santa Marta, which is probably a better known town right now. It's a bigger town now. Ciénaga was an important trading town, and the guy arrived there probably looking for fortune. He found a woman from a costeña from the town of Ciénaga, and he formed a trading firm with the lady's brothers. And then his son moved to Bogotá to deal with the company. And then from there, it's very easy to trace the story, because there's a tradition that the grandson has the name of the grandfather in my family. So that guy who moved to Bogotá, his name was Emilio, whose son is Alberto, whose son is Emilio, whose son is Alberto, and that Alberto is my father. So that's where we come from. And this guy and Peter probably came from Jamaica, because we have found that his mother was Jamaican. So that's where we come from. And Fergusson is indeed a Scottish name.
Okay, yeah, well, probably a bit too far removed for yourself to get a British passport if you wanted one.
Yeah, well, yeah, that is very far removed. Yeah. Maybe if Scotland becomes independent, that's one hope that my father has. Maybe we can apply for the Scottish one.
We better not get into that, or we'll be here all night. Yeah. But this was certainly a quarantine lockdown chat. We had a lot of time to discuss.
Not of much use right now, the passports, and I'm a very proud Colombian, but yeah.
Indeed. Just if people want to read your work, have you a website, Leopoldo, that they can find you on?
Of course, yeah, it's very easy. It's just leopoldofergusson.com. The only thing is that Fergusson is written with 2 S's.
Yeah.
But you'll find it very easily, and if not, you just ask for Leopoldo Fergusson on Google, and there is no other Leopoldo Fergusson that I have found thus far in the world. So that's an unusual name and last name and an unusual combination.
Indeed, so. You are truly unique. Then, so Leopoldo, thanks a million for joining us here on Wrong Ways Colombia Cast. That is our lot for this episode. Remember, if you want to get in touch with me, you can. Via the Twitter handle at WA Corrigan, or on my Facebook page, that's Wrong Way Corrigan blog. But until the next time, ciao ciao.